A very good morning to all of you watching Good Morning Sri Lanka on MTV Sports. What with that chilly weather, you just feel like going back to sleep, don't you? But then again, you've decided to wake up, and I'm sure it'll be a great day. The weather is looking good, and today is the 31st of October, which is also the end of a month, and also today has been named as the World Thrift Day. So let's take a look at some of the headlines before we move on to the next part of the show. On the front page of the Daily Mirror, we have the leading story, UPFA plans to impeach CJ. The constituent parties of the ruling United People's Freedom Alliance decided yesterday at a meeting with the President to bring an impeachment motion against Chief Justice Shirani Bandaranaike. It goes on to say that they have discussed their charges to be levelled against the Chief Justice in such an exercise. And moving on, an aviation fuel leak from a damaged pipeline. The fumes from the aviation fuel leaking from the damaged pipeline at Orugodawatta left one man hospitalized, and the supervising workers who were repairing the pipeline at Orugodawatta said that the man had to be hospitalized. So there we go, an aviation fuel leak from a damaged pipeline in Orugodawatta. And moving on to more local stories, the radio stations will be reallocated new frequencies from tomorrow onwards. That's the 1st of November. And of course, as you all know, Yes FM, your favorite radio station, will be heard on 100.8 or 101. That's Yes FM, which will move on to 100.8 and 101, and the whole list of radio stations have been reallocated with new frequencies, and this is a move in order to better probably broadcast the radio channels, and this in keeping with the national policy. So there we go, radio stations will be moved to new frequencies. Furthermore, government debt has been estimated to top 6,000 billion rather, so that's about 6 trillion. Sri Lanka's total outstanding government debt stood at rupees 6,161 billion at the end of July 2012, and against rupees 4,975 billion, that's about 4.9 trillion, reported during the same period of the previous year, says Central Bank. And this is probably disturbing news for all of us, but the total debt had increased to 6 trillion as of now, and this is about 2 trillion more than last year's figures at the same time of the year. So there we go. Let's look at some of the local stories as well. Moving on to some local political stories, UMP will take part to register in protest. The UMP said that it will participate in the Parliamentary Select Committee reportedly being planned to be appointed by the government to investigate charges levelled against Chief Justice Shirani Bandaranaike. So this is in retaliation or in response to the UPFA's plans to impeach the Chief Justice Shirani Bandaranaike. Moving on to international stories, of course, taking headlines, we have the natural disaster that's been titled as a major disaster by US President Barack Obama, hitting most parts of the US, especially New York and eastern United States. The storm, rather, the superstorm as it's been named, has already taken its toll, and CNN reports that it has killed 30 people already. Floodwaters rushed into New York's subway tunnels and left neighborhood streets across the northeast looking like rivers, and homes washed off their foundations, and New Jersey was hit pretty hard as well. Heavy winds sent power lines and trees crashing to the ground. So a monster storm cripples New York and eastern USA. This is what the headlines say about this, and millions of people were left reeling in the aftermath of Monster Storm Sandy on Tuesday. Now, moving on with the Storm Sandy, and a lot of analysts say that this is one part that has clearly been overlooked in the US presidential debates. They've been talking a lot about different topics, about national policy and so on and so forth, but about natural disasters and disaster management, it has clearly been a topic that has been overlooked. And analyst says that things like the Superstorm Sandy really is an eye-opener for the politicians and policymakers to rethink very strongly about disaster management and how they can better respond to natural disasters such as this. So we hope that will clear out too. And in Sri Lanka, the weather department said that the mini cyclone named as Neelam was going to affect the coastal areas of Sri Lanka, but then thankfully it has not, and it is moving along the eastern coastal areas, and it will not be affecting Sri Lanka per se. So that's a bit about the international stories and how natural disasters can really take its toll. Moving on to sports news, we move on to the cricket that's been happening in between Sri Lanka and New Zealand. And the first 2020 that was scheduled to take place yesterday was washed out. The opening match of New Zealand's 5-week tour of Sri Lanka was ruined by bad weather on Tuesday, and the first 2020 was called off because Sri Lanka only managed to play 2 overs in response to the very small total that they managed to restrict the New Zealanders. They only managed to score 74 for the loss of 7 wickets. And talking about cricket, there is an interesting development because new development by the ICC says that day-night test matches will be, a definite possibility moving on into the future. Day-night test cricket, possibly played with a pink, orange or yellow ball, is an inevitability. Now the way has been cleared for such matches, and this is a statement by Cricket Australia. And the ICC also decreed on Monday that countries could agree to play day-night tests, and if both the countries obviously agree, and depending on the ball, and a pre-decision made on what type of ball that they'll be using as well. And also in some of the local school stories, sports stories rather, the annual soccer encounter between Trinity College Kandy and St. Thomas's College was worked off yesterday, and it ended as a draw with 0-all to both teams. And that's a bit about the local stories as well. Now moving on to a story that we've been discussing quite often about Lance Armstrong. I mean, we still can't get over the fact that this man who has been such a legend has been called off. And this story is about how after Armstrong's fall, the case for performance enhancements has really taken the highlight. In the past month, cyclist Lance Armstrong has been stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles, and looking at any sports, people running, swimming or whatever they do, the main focus of the recent past have been how they have really engaged in things that are not ethical, how they have resorted to taking performance enhancing drugs and other supplements, and this is definitely going to take a highlight position in sports in general all over the world. And the picture shows Lance Armstrong at the completion of one of his Tour de France, and he has been stripped of all his titles. And it says that after stories like this really brings out the need for proper monitoring and proper taking steps in order to prevent from sportsmen using banned substances and performance enhancing drugs as well. Now, after the commercial break, we are going to have a very special guest in the studio who is going to talk to us about a lot of the work that he's been doing. We mentioned his organization on the show as well, but right about now, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back on Good Morning Sri Lanka. Good morning and welcome back to Good Morning Sri Lanka on MTV Sports. Now, if you've just tuned in, don't worry, you've just come at the right time, because I'm just about to welcome someone who I met quite recently, but who's turned out to be one of my good friends, and who also introduced me to hosting the show. We have in the studio with us Prashant Divisa. Prashant, very good morning to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back.
Yes, and how does it feel to be on the other side of the chair?
It's a little strange. I feel like I want to host the show, but then again I remember, no, I'm the guest now. And it's a joy to see you enjoying yourself and doing a great job.
Definitely. And it's very interesting because I think the first time I came on the show as a guest, you were interviewing me. And then later on, probably the last show that you did was with me, was it? Or maybe
one of the last shows we co-hosted.
And I believe that you started off as a host in the same manner as well.
Yes, I was a guest on the show about 4 years ago, Danu was interviewing me, and we talked about what we're going to talk about today, about Sri Lanka Unites, and then I ended up joining the crew as well.
So 4 years is a long time. So just let us start off with saying what exactly Sri Lanka Unites is. We featured Sri Lanka Unites and mentioned a bit about your in the recent past as well. But if you'd just like to tell our viewers what exactly Sri Lanka Unites is.
Sure. Sri Lanka Unites is a youth movement for hope and reconciliation in post-war Sri Lanka. What we see is that after 30 years of war and 3 decades of extreme violence and brutality, a country needs to recover, and the journey towards recovery should include the young people, especially because young people were really impacted by what happened. So what we started doing is, how can we, as young people in this country, really work towards leading that journey towards reconciliation, not just being part of it, but how can young people lead the way? Because the reality is, once we have so much of conflict and hatred, the older generation is tainted with a lot of hatred and bitterness, and it's difficult for them to move on or to learn how to take the next steps. So ironically, it becomes the role of the youth to start taking those steps forward, and also making sure that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. So we just wanted to dive into it and see what it looked like if young people started engaging in reconciliation issues. And so we began the journey later towards 2008, and since then we've been coming in, bringing young people together. There's a stat that says over 70% of Sri Lankan youth don't have a friend outside their ethnic or religious group. Over 70%. So it's difficult for us to talk about a reconciled Sri Lanka or a united Sri Lanka when there's so much segregation. And it's important that we bring these people together. So that's the very first step we do in Sri Lanka Unites, of bringing these people together, helping them to create an inclusive Sri Lankan identity and growing together as one.
And over the course of these 4 or 5 years, how have you seen, on the onset, have you seen that there have been a gradual progress in terms of reconciliation? And obviously you work with the youth. Is there a definite change? Do they actually say that, you know, probably the people you interact with now, do they say that they're much more friendly or more interactive with people from other ethnic groups rather than what they said some years before?
Exactly. The results have definitely been rewarding, and it's kind of fueled the movement to continue doing what we're doing. But the reality is that people need to understand that the end of the war is not the end of the conflict. A war was an outward manifestation of a deeper problem. There were hurts. And the reality is, if you have over 70% of the population not interacting with each other, that's perfect breeding ground for prejudices and negative stereotypes. So in fact, when we went down south early in the movement, when we started off, and interviewed some of our Sinhala Buddhist students, and to ask them to tell us 10 things about the Tamil community, you know, 7 out of 10 things they said were negative. And then we followed the question up with, have you ever met a Tamil person? And the answer almost always, down south, was no. And then we follow that up saying, how could you come to this conclusion? And that's when you get stumped, and they're, well, I think my father told me this, or my grandfather did, or I read it in the media. We did the same in the north. We asked them about the Sinhala community, and once again, about 7 out of 10 things they said were negative, but without an actual relationship or interaction with a civilian who is a Sinhalese. So what we're doing is, by bringing these people together, we've seen so much of prejudices go away. Of, you know, saying, well, maybe it was a broad statement, a generalization of an entire community. Yes, there have been extremists on both communities who have hurt each other, but we need to understand that we can't stereotype entire communities. And we're getting over 10,000 kids in our movement who signed the pledge, who are saying, I want to be the change. I want to help create a united Sri Lanka. I'm not going to allow hateful rhetoric to be part of who I am. And so these young men and women around the country, representing all 25 districts, are making a difference. And it's been an absolute joy and a privilege to see how the movement has progressed. And we're excited that this is just the beginning, and the best is yet to come.
Exactly. And you know, you adopt a very grassroots strategy where you focus mainly on the A-level students who will be leaving out there to society, to the beauties and the evils of society. Now, just wanted to ask you, one of your main projects is the Future Leaders Conference. If you'd just like to mention about what exactly the purpose of having such a conference is.
The Future Leaders Conference is what gets most of the attention because it is the largest event where we bring head prefects,